Well, we've got Patricia Streng on the line, and we're going to talk about her book, Native American Resilience, a story of racism, genocide, and survival. The book covers the racism and genocide that marked the relationship between Native Americans and the colonizers. So, good afternoon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. And you, Toby?
Yes, I am doing great, thank you. So, what led you to have this interest in Native American history?
I was a non-traditional student, meaning that I was much older than the rest of the kids that I was going to school with. And I took, in my last year of school, I took a class on American history. And in that, I learned about Native Americans in a way that I never had before. And it got me interested. And then later, I was invited to a luncheon for graduating non-traditional students. I was sitting at a table with people that were discussing the fact that the Native Americans had been pretty well eliminated from discussions as a result of the 1948 UN resolution on genocide. And that really, really upset me. So those two things are what precipitated my interest and my continuing research.
Whereabouts were you living during that time?
At that time, I was living in Kentucky, which is a state that's kind of in the middle of the United States and east of the Mississippi River. And that was an area that was very well settled by Native Americans, with Kentucky being reserved as their mutual hunting area. So I just so happened that I was living in an area that had been heavily populated by Native American people.
And how did that influence your interest in the Native American history? Did it make it even stronger?
It did. In addition to that, the Native American museum that is in North Carolina is a Cherokee museum. And that's what then helped me really understand more about the Cherokee and the struggles that they went through.
Yeah. Part one of your book features the Cherokee.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about them and their culture, if you can.
Native Americans in general have occupied what is now known as the United States for centuries. And the Cherokee were a group that lived and occupied they weren't a large number of people, but they did occupy part of what became 5 states in the United States. And North Carolina has a group of Cherokee currently living there, and they have their own government. But the majority of the Cherokee were forced to migrate to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi River. And so they have a large community there. I believe now they have over 300,000 people, not all living in that area, but members of the Cherokee tribe of Oklahoma.
What part would you say racism played in the settlement of the Americas?
As I was researching this, I was amazed because racism is evident in the writing of 4th century people, and those were taken from the ancient Greece historians. And at that early in that stage, Asians were depicted as being fully clothed, often scrumptiously so. Africans were attired and sometimes revealing, but always elegantly clothed. And the people of the New World were considered to be physically and biologically different and less than Europeans. Basically, they were considered to be beasts. So, as we progressed, of course, then the these explorers came with Columbus, and after him, The population of the Americas was decimated first unknowingly and then purposely when diseases were introduced because the natives had no natural immunity to those diseases. Then war killed off many, many of them. Others were captured and took as slaves to Europe. I didn't realize that Columbus had been an African slave trader before he became an explorer.
Mm.
And so it was just natural for him to take slaves back to Europe. Some of the tactics that were used, which horrified me, were called dogging tactics. And the European explorers actually took mastiffs and other large dogs that they had used to fight in the wars in Europe. They took them with them, and the natives had never seen dogs, and they were terrified of them. And the explorers would grab the babies from the mother's arms and throw them to the dogs, and they would just rip them apart.
Wow.
And so it was a very brutal era.
I think it's a widely known fact that we often credit Christopher Columbus with the discovery of the Americas, but there were already people there, so he didn't really discover anything.
That's correct. And that's why there has been a pushback over the last five to 10 years that we shouldn't celebrate Columbus Day because it's a celebration of the discovery, and he didn't.
Yeah. What part would you say the various European countries played in settling America?
The English and others deliberately attacked the non-combatants. So they didn't just focus on fighting the men. They would go and they would deliberately destroy and the crops, the housing, and kill the women and children. And there was one particular incident that occurred in the mid 1600s where there was a mass murder of over 700 men, women, and children who were actually celebrating their green corn ceremony, which was equivalent to our Thanksgiving. And the soldiers shot them as they came out of their meeting houses, and those that they didn't shoot and remained inside were burned alive. And the governor of Massachusetts celebrated this as a victory over the enemy and the first official Thanksgiving Day, which of course does not go with the traditional Thanksgiving Day that we think of and celebrate here, where the Indians brought food and we all sat down and celebrated a meal together.
So after the war for independence from Britain, how did the new American government deal with the Indians?
The colonists turned their fighting from the English to their attention to the American Indians using tactics that they had learned when fighting the Irish. And Washington, who is celebrated as one of our great presidents, actually told his generals in 1779 and in 1783 that it was a war of extermination, that the Indians were considered mere beasts and they were something to get rid of to the last man, woman, and child. But interestingly, Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, along with many others, studied the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And they were a group of Native Americans that lived along the East Coast. And this law of peace was used, and Jefferson submitted in 1754 a plan for a representative government based on that Iroquois Great Law of Peace. Then later, they utilized federal trading houses to get the Indians to sell their land. The trading houses were where the Indians would go to buy muskets and ammunition and iron tools that they didn't have access to. and cloth. And they would get the Indians in debt to these trading houses, and then they would clear the debt by the Indians agreed to sell their land. So that was a big way that they were able to gain land without going to war with the Indians.
And what was the involvement of the Cherokee in the Civil War?
By then, they had been forced to move to the west of the Mississippi River. And what I didn't know was that the Cherokee, along with a lot of the other Native Americans, actually had slaves. Because when they were east of the Mississippi, they had plantations and they grew cotton and all this, just like the settlers were doing. So the slaves went with them. And during the war, then Cherokee, they were divided on whether they should fight with the North or the South. And ultimately, they went with the South. One of the reasons was that the Northern government cut off the money that they were supposed to pay the Cherokee because they were afraid that they would use that money to buy war goods that would be used against the North. Another reason is because the Northern government never did give any of the Indians, and particularly the Cherokee, who are considered one of the 5 civilized tribes, did not ever give them a right to sit with a representative in the government. So that was 2 things that the South did that the Northern Army didn't do, and that was a good reason for the Cherokee to go with the Southern group. That turned later, and they went to the North because Chief John Ross, who was a very well-educated Native American Cherokee, and he had not wanted to go with the South, and he finally convinced the Cherokees that they needed to go with the Northern people.
Yeah. Now, a few moments ago, you pretty much described a genocide, and you actually talk about that in part 2 of your book. Where did the concept for that come from?
Interestingly, there was not a concept for genocide until after World War II, and they were finding the concentration camps and learning about the number of deaths of civilians that came about during World War II, before, and during. And that came to the conversation of so many people I guess I can say worldwide, because so many people were involved in the war. And one of the people that immigrated to the United States was a Polish lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. And he came here to escape the persecution of the Holocaust in 1941, and felt that there needed to be something to describe what was going on. So he is the one that actually coined the concept of genocide. Then in 1948, the UN resolution on genocide was written, and it was voted on by President Truman. Actually voted and signed it, but Congress did not agree, and it was not until 1988, 40 years later, that it was signed by President Reagan during a stopover in Chicago. At that point, it had been significantly changed because the U.S. was concerned about charges that would be levied against them for their genocide against Native people specifically, but also other ethnic groups.
What would you say are some of the other social issues affecting Native Americans today?
During the 1950s, the U.S. government implemented a program called of relocation. They were trying to get the Native people off of reservations and moved to the cities, primarily the cities along the middle of the country and on the West Coast. So Chicago, LA, San Francisco, those cities. And they kind of just moved them there, but didn't really provide them with the resources to find a job, to get an apartment, or any of those kinds of things. So it was a very disruptive relocation of the people. Some of them were able to find jobs and get settled into them, and they lived there and raised their families there. Others stayed for a while, maybe 5-10 years, and then they ended up moving back to the reservations. We also have a large problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women and children here in the States, with 506 of them missing in 71 urban cities in 2020 alone.
Wow.
So, that is a big problem. Something that you have probably heard about, because Canada and the US have been in the news with the boarding schools that were instituted. These were done to separate the children from their parents, from their communities, and they had a large emotional, physical, and sexual problem with them being forced to attend those schools, with over 500 unmarked graves that have been found on the various school grounds. The children, when they were taken to the schools, the first things they had was their braids were cut. They were forced to wear white men's clothing and shoes, and only English could be spoken. And of course, when you've never spoken that language and you're in a new environment, and you have to ask questions and you don't know how, so you do it in your native tongue. And they were punished severely for using their native language.
Yeah. So how many federal recognized Indian tribes are there in the US currently?
There are 574 currently recognized. The importance of being a federally recognized tribe is that they are eligible for funding and services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, either directly or through contracts, grants, or compacts, which gives them monies that otherwise they would not be eligible for.
And how come they need this money then?
Native Americans living on reservations are some of the poorest. A lot of them are equivalent to third world countries. They don't have running water. A lot of them live 3 or 4 generations in a 2 or maybe a 3-room hogan or a small home. They need it for living. That's why that funding, and also the services that's provided because of the treaties that were signed during the during the 1800s. And these treaties, unless they have been dissolved, are still federally recognized. And it requires that they provide medical services, among other things, which was very important as we got to COVID.
Well, what's next for you? Do you have any more books planned after this?
I did consider a second Native American book. I have since decided not to do that, partly because it has been so incredibly difficult to get my book published and out there before the public. And so I am pretty much focusing on getting that done, because I think the information that's in it is extremely important in this racially divided world that we're living in now. I think the more that we know, the better relationships will be among and between us.
In the meantime, where can we find your book?
It is on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Should be on Google before long. And it is available in hardcover and soft, and also it can be downloaded and read on any number of tablets.
Excellent. Well, the book is called Native American Resilience, A Story of Racism, Genocide and Survival, and it's by Patricia Streng. So many thanks for joining us today. It's been great to talk to you.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Toby.